and it has begun now. Thankfully, it's only been introductions. We've gone through Anna Holleman and Dr. Ammerman, and now Joseph Roso, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at Duke University. He studies the sociology of religion with a particular focus on religious organizations and communal worship practices. And Joseph, I got your message regarding a screen share. I'll just allow that right now. And you should have the ability to do it now. So please have the floor, both of you.
Okay, thank you so much, Nathan. And all right. Can everyone see that?
Yep, looks good.
All right. So thank you so much for our work. Okay, awesome. As we know, COVID has had a massive impact on social life. And religious organizations are no exception to this. So in this pandemic, there are two key challenges facing religious organizations. The inability to gather in person, and also the challenges of finances in the midst of a giant economic recession. That congregations can have that may have helped them blunt some of the negative impacts of COVID. So for an inability to gather, congregations that had an online presence, a website or social media page of some kind, or the ability to stream or record worship may have been able to connect with parishioners even without meeting in person. And for finances, congregations that had a substantial savings account or an ability to receive electronic donations may have been able to maintain a source of consistent income and be more buffeted against the negative effects of an economic downturn. Now, these capacities are almost certainly not distributed equally across the religious landscape. And so we examine the ways in which these capacities may be stratified on the basis of various sources that we know typically stratify these sorts of things. So we look at religious tradition, the size of the congregation, its location in a rural or urban area, as well as the race, the age, and the socioeconomic class of the members of the congregation. And so overall, we want to ask two fundamental questions. One, how vulnerable were congregations overall to the effects of the pandemic? And two, which congregations were the most vulnerable? And so to answer these questions, we use data from the National Congregations Study. And so the National Congregation Study is a nationally representative survey of congregations. There are about 1,200 congregations that completed the most recent wave, conducted in 2018-19. And so we use this wave, which ended data collection within a year of the pandemic hitting, so it'll provide a really good baseline on the eve of the pandemic. And there are many important questions that were asked by the survey, but for our purposes, some of the most important ones are whether or not the congregation had an online presence, such as a website or other social media page, whether the congregation streamed or recorded their worship services, if the congregation had a savings account, if they did, how big is that savings account, and could that congregation receive donations financially? And all this is before the pandemic struck. So congregations that are in these categories are better potentially in the pandemic. And then for the sources of stratification, for ease of explanation here, we dichotomized a lot of these measures as such, splitting into Catholic, non-Catholic, congregations with under 100 adults versus those with 100 or more, rural versus suburban or urban congregations, predominantly Black versus not predominantly Black, congregations with more older people versus those with fewer, and congregations with more folks making under $35,000 a year versus those with more folks making under $35,000 a year. Sorry if that's a little wordy. If you have any questions about how we measured things, feel free to ask us. But we want to get into the results. And so for the results, when it comes to technology, overall, we found that most congregations had some sort of technological infrastructure prior to the pandemic. So 87%, about 5 in 6 congregations had a website or social media page. Streaming worship services was a bit rare, but still a clear majority of congregations had streamed or recorded a worship service recently, which potentially means that most congregations had some capability to move to an online form of worship as the pandemic set in. But, and this shouldn't be too surprising, these capacities were not equally distributed across the religious landscape. And as a quick note here, we're going to present a lot of differences. All the differences that we present are statistically significant at least the 0.05 alpha level. And so if you don't see a comparison from one of the groups we mentioned, it's probably because there wasn't a statistically significant difference. Now, we found that rural and small congregations were much less likely to have an online presence. So about 3/4 of rural congregations had a website or social media page, and about 9 in 10 urban and suburban congregations did. And for size, about 83% of smaller congregations had an online presence, whereas the vast majority of larger congregations did. And there are similar kinds of differences when it comes to race and also socioeconomic class. So predominantly Black congregations, about 3/4 of them had an online presence, whereas 90% of not predominantly Black congregations did. And when it comes to SES, a similar kind of difference where congregations with more lower income members were less likely to have an online presence. Now, of course, it's still the vast majority of congregations in these categories have an online presence, but the inequality is real. However, it does compound when we think about these categories compounding on each other. So congregations that are rural and predominantly Black were particularly unlikely to have any sort of online presence. So whereas remember, it was a clear large majority of congregations overall that had some presence, only 46% of rural and predominantly Black congregations had a website or Facebook page or some way to communicate to parishioners. And this is the only category that we examined of all the innumerable categories we examined where it was a minority of congregations that had an online presence. So congregations in this particular category will have to work extra hard to make sure they're keeping. Now, when it comes to streaming, streaming overall is rarer than having a website or Facebook page. It requires more technological knowledge, but there are differences. And perhaps the most striking difference here is religious tradition. The Catholic versus non-Catholic difference is quite massive. Only 1 in 5 Catholic congregations had any sort of streaming, whereas 6 in 10 of non-Catholic congregations did. Note, it's not Protestant, it's non-Catholic here because this is including non-Christian congregations as well. And there are also differences when it comes to size and age. So only about half of congregations with under 100 adults had streaming, whereas 3/4 of larger congregations did. And then also age differences where congregations with more older members were less likely to have any sort of streaming. And this is particularly important because, as we know, older people are more vulnerable to the health effects of COVID. And it turns out that many of them are in congregations that themselves were potentially less equipped to shift to a safer all online worship service as the pandemic struck. So those are the findings when it comes to technology. And now, oh yes, there's one more finding, which is contrary to expectations, Black congregations were actually more likely to have streaming. So about 2/3 streaming, whereas only about half of not predominantly Black congregations did. So in this particular way, predominantly Black congregations may be actually a little bit more advantageously positioned to shift to all online streaming, which is surprising based off what we know from previous research on digital inequality. Now, so those are the findings for technology. I'm going to hand it off to Anna, who will discuss differences in finances.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so like Joseph said earlier, we are focusing on two features of congregations' finances prior to the pandemic. First, having a savings account, as well as the percent of the congregation's budget in that account. And second, the ability to receive financial donations electronically. So overall, we see that 2/3 of congregations had any savings before the pandemic, which means, of course, that 1/3 of congregations had absolutely no savings at all. Only 1/4 of congregations had 6 months worth of their budget in savings, and only 18% had a year's financial cushion. So only a small minority of congregations had substantial savings prior to COVID. Also, we see that about half of congregations were able to receive donations electronically. So overall, we see that religious congregations nationally were generally underprepared for the pandemic economic context. And this is in contrast to the technological findings that Joseph presented, where most congregations had at least some level of preparedness. Joseph, can you switch to the next slide? Thanks, perfect. Cool. So when looking specifically at congregations with no savings, we see the biggest differences by race. So almost half of all predominantly Black congregations had no savings, as compared to less than 1/3 of non-Black congregations. Additionally, we see that size and social class were also determining factors, as congregations that were smaller and congregations with more low-income parishioners were also more likely to have zero savings. And notably absent from the slide, we don't talk about rural status, religious tradition, or parishioner age here, because again, these were not significant predictors of having savings. Great. So when we think about what this means for congregations on the ground, we know that it's likely that many Black congregations also have more low-income parishioners. And so these two demographic factors would likely combine to create an even more stark reality. So when we compare congregations that are both predominantly Black as well as low income against congregations that are not both of these, we see big differences in savings. So almost no congregations that are both Black and low income had a substantial financial cushion in the long term, while about 1/5 of other congregations did. So now moving to congregations' ability to receive electronic donations, we see that a slightly different set of demographics predicted vulnerability according to this measure. So first, we see that rural congregations and smaller congregations were about half as likely to be able to receive electronic donations than urban or suburban and larger congregations, which is a jump of a really fairly large magnitude. We also see a difference by age, where older congregations are less likely to be able to receive electronic donations as compared to younger congregations, which again mirrors our earlier findings that Joseph presented on technological capabilities. And again, thinking about how these factors intersect with one another in congregations on the ground realities, when thinking about congregations that are both small and rural, their deficit in this measure is even more apparent. So congregations that are either bigger or non-rural are about 2.5 times as likely to be able to receive electronic donations as congregations that are both small and rural. So again, we see that the intersections of these demographic factors compound on a variety of ways, even ways that we have not had time to explore today. So in conclusion, we have shown that congregations varied substantially in technological and financial preparedness on the eve of the pandemic. Rural, small, predominantly Black, and low-income congregations seem to be the most vulnerable. Additionally, technological infrastructure was particularly lacking among Catholic churches and older congregations. Also, we examined congregations' technological capacities and financial preparedness separately, but congregations that were the least prepared in one of these areas often were also the least prepared in the other. So these variables are clearly intertwined and related to one another, which makes sense, but that also means that their co-presence could be particularly detrimental in the context of the pandemic. And another important point here is that this paper is really only intended to lay out a baseline of congregational capacities on the eve of the pandemic. Many congregations adapted quickly to our new normal. Clergy quickly learned how to use Zoom or Facebook Live, how to set up an electronic donation system like Venmo or PayPal. Additionally, some initial research on church finances that's come out recently has shown that congregations are doing better during the pandemic in terms of finances than we would have expected. So we don't fully know yet how these inequalities on the eve of the pandemic are shaping congregations' current and future realities, but we hope that our study and our contribution will offer a lens through which to understand those unfolding realities. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to the Q&A in a little bit.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was a wonderful presentation. If we could give a little bit of appreciation for both of our presenters. And now we'll go to Dr. Nancy Ammerman for 3 to 4 minutes of her initial response to their presentation.
And of course, I have to remember to unmute. This really is a very well-conceived paper, and I'm looking forward to the way you develop it. And I look forward to reading it, like in JSSR, a review of religious research in the near future. The fact that these data came in right as a baseline is amazing, and I think that's going to be really useful to lots of folks in the future. And here, I think you've chosen really good variables to look at the financial and technological capacities as key foci, and you identify a really good set of differences to examine in the characteristics of the congregations. I think one of the things that you may want to do as you think about expanding this is expanding your review of the literature, if you will, something you can't really do in a paper like this, but particularly to ask, what is it about those characteristics, size, race, et cetera? What's a theoretical frame that can help you say why it is those characteristics of congregations are the ones that really matter here? What basic understanding of congregational life is underlying your analysis here? How do congregations in these different categories think about how they work differently? How do congregations in these different categories think about what they're doing? So then when you look at your results and you see how Catholics stand out on one variable, why is that? What is that about the way Catholics approach parish life that's different, or how rural churches are distinctive, or how Black churches do their work differently, or what it really means to be mostly full of older and poorer members? I think that kind of cultural underpinning will be a really important additional aspect of the story you're telling here. I think two of the stories that really beg for more depth is the very low rate of online presence among Catholic parishes. That's really interesting. And the very low rate of savings accounts among Black churches. In some ways, we might not be surprised by that, but it may be interesting to dig in and say, what are the cultural stories, the structural stories that are embedded in how these congregations understand their work and are able to do their work? One of the other things you have a hint of course, is that some small congregations were nevertheless into online worship. already, and you suggest that this may reflect a connection to the high-tech evangelical megachurches. And that's, I think, hinting at or pushing toward combining variables in ways that your presentation did very nicely. All the way through reading your paper, I was thinking about, in some ways, small, rural, poor, tends to be sort of, cumulative as you're showing. And I actually wondered whether it would be useful or possible to, in effect, form an index of vulnerability. That might be a useful way to present what you're looking at, or simply to tackle some multivariate analyses with your data. So I think this is really an excellent draft, and I look forward to you expanding it with a more nuanced sort of cultural analysis of the way congregations work. Play with your statistics a bit, and I'll look forward to reading it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ammerman. So let me introduce our next set of presenters, of which there are 4 by their biographies. Andrew Gertner Belfield is a doctoral candidate in historical and systematic theology at Boston College. His dissertation studies the Christology of the 13th century Summa Fratris Alexandri, its reception in the medieval period, and the possibilities it presents to Christology today. Kelly Kossar received her master's in Jewish education with a specialization in special education in 2020 from the Schulman Graduate School of Jewish Education at Hebrew College. Her master's thesis, entitled Gentle Leadership in a Noisy World, looks at the intersection of Jewish educators and introversion. She also received a master's in educational leadership in synagogues and communal settings from the William Davidson Graduate School of Jewish Education at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in 2016, with a specialization in Israel education from the I Center. Additionally, Kelly received a certificate in Jewish education, specializing in adolescents and emerging adults from Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in 2013. Laurel Marshall Potter is a PhD student of systematic and comparative theology at Boston College. Her research centers on the contemporary experience of ecclesial-based communities in Mesoamerica, especially around popular religiosity, liturgy, and decolonial praxis. Laurel's work includes Sigue porque la vida sigue, Voce de las Comunidades Eclesiales de Salvador ayer y hoy, from Library Partners Press, 2020. Undoubtedly, I botched the pronunciation, Laurel, I'm sorry. And then finally, Elli Pripas, I'm so sorry if I'm saying it incorrectly, is a current rabbinical student at Hebrew College in Boston, where she is pursuing a master's in Jewish education as well as ordination. She previously earned her master's in educational leadership from Minnesota State University, Mankato, and her bachelor's in women's, gender, and sexuality studies from Macalester College. And she served last year as the fellow for interreligious programming for the Walker Center for Ecumenical Exchange and Miller Center for Interreligious Programming. So let's welcome our 4 presenters today. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Our paper today is entitled Basic Human Communities, an Interreligious Alternative to Zoom Worship in the Era of COVID. So there are 4 presenters today, and we're each going to take some time to share different aspects of our paper. Barton House is an intentional residence in Auburndale, Massachusetts. 8 tenants live in a Frankenstein's monster of a house, sharing a kitchen, common space, and a desire to live in an ecologically sustainable, justice-seeking, and especially interreligious community. We are Jewish, Christian, Muslim, spiritual but not quite religious, LGBTQ+, neurodiverse, differently abled, married, partnered, single, parenting, multilingual, multicultural, international, intergenerational, and interspecies. In addition to the struggles COVID-19 has wrought generally, 2 consequences of the pandemic have hit our home particularly hard. First, the inability to physically attend our separate houses of worship. And second, housing insecurity as a result of our landlord's financial failure during the pandemic and decision to sell the property where we live. In response to both, and in response to the pandemic in general, we have knit ourselves together as each other's pod over the last 11 months. Most significantly for this presentation, we've negotiated interreligious worship and practice that includes weekly house liturgies, celebrations of our different religious and cultural holidays, and spontaneous conversation about religious and spiritual similarity and difference. These religious practices are inseparable from and informed our responses to the cultural and social developments of 2020, including the incoherence and violence of the Trump administration, the increased visibility, systematic racism and policing in other institutions in the United States, worldwide housing and job insecurity, including our own, and a global public health crisis. Upon reflection, our experience as a house have raised two sets of questions for us. First of all, if returning in person to our own houses of worship becomes possible in the near future, what will become of our house liturgies, communal celebrations, and spontaneous spiritual practices and dialogue? Secondly, can our experience of fruitful, relevant, faith-forming worship at home reveal any potential correctives for our own involvement in our respective traditions for various ways of organizing, leading, and celebrating our faiths? In short, does our experience of interreligious home worship during the pandemic inform our hope for our own traditions' worship practices in the as yet determined future? We feel that it does, and this presentation is an attempt to articulate how our experiences will inform our future spiritual and religious lives.
We have found some useful theoretical tools in Tracy Sawicki T. Meyer's essay, Comparative Theology as a Theology of Liberation. T. Meyer reflects that in addition to the essential link between religion and politics established by Christian Latin American liberation theologians in the 1960s and 1970s, Asian and Asian American liberation theologians have recognized culture as another important element in the reality of our religious practice. Because there is no one Asian or Asian American culture, says T. Meyer, there are many different iterations of an Asian or Asian American liberation theology. Negotiating religion and justice, including determining which issues are most important or which values are highest priority, is different in different contexts. Additionally, different cultures are imbued with different mixes of religious practices, and so negotiating a quote-unquote Christian faith that does justice for Asian and Asian American religious communities is more readily understood to be an effort of interreligious dialogue and comparative theology. Christian Asians and Asian Americans belonging to different ethnic or national groups have different familial and cultural connections to Buddhism, to Hinduism, to Islam, to Taoism, to Confucianism, to Shinto, and to other religious and spiritual practices, which are part of the religio-cultural differences and priorities that are negotiated within an Asian and Asian American Christian faith that does justice.
Because the category of culture includes but does not exhaust the multiple religious or spiritual influences or practices at play in human societies, an intercultural effort to address issues of justice from religious belief should be explicitly interreligious. Thus, T. Meyer's connection between comparative theology and the Christian liberation theology of 20th century Latin America, or to relate this idea to Jewish currents of thought, the ideal of tikkun olam. The recognition of culture's place in the matrix of central elements of justice-seeking religious practice means that Christian liberation theology cannot and should not be only Christian. Likewise, the pursuit of tikkun olam cannot be only Jewish. A place needs to exist for these different religious dreams to coexist and to inform each other. To this end, T. Meyer upholds Sri Lankan Jesuit Aloysius Pieris's concept of basic human communities as one place where this kind of comparative or interreligious justice-seeking practice takes place. Christian Latin American liberation theology proposed an ecclesiology described in 1968 by the Latin American bishops at Medellin, in which ecclesial-based communities, SEBs by their initials in Spanish, not parishes, were considered to be the initial cell of ecclesiastical structures. The SEBs were ecclesial places. Salvadoran theologian John Sobrino would call them teologal places, where groups of Christians applied their faith to the justice issues of their contexts, seeking to act faithfully in the world outside of church. According to Thiemeyer, basic human communities represent an evolution of ecclesial-based communities that exchange Christian identity with a human, though not a religious, identity, while maintaining a commitment both to communal life and a preferential option for the poor. Basic human communities are then theologal spaces where multiple religio-cultural traditions inform a group's approach to the world beyond the basic human community. Returning to our experience sharing religious communal life at Barton House, the framework of basic human communities helps us understand and reflect on our experiences.
Barton House is a basic human community.
Barton House is a basic human community.
Ellie, go ahead.
Okay. Barton House is a basic human community. Like many people of faith, residents of Barton House grieved the loss of in-person worship at our own various churches, synagogues, and communities, as many houses of worship began to hold virtual services in March 2020. While these virtual services filled some spiritual needs, many of us were left yearning for in-person community. As the first pandemic weekend approached, we gathered haphazardly in our yard in an overcast, chilly Saturday afternoon with our religious texts and other significant books, instruments, textiles, and natural elements. We consecrated a spiritual space among those gathered and thereby instituted a new communal practice. In subsequent weeks, rotating community members would meet to plan house-wide interreligious services.
Kelly, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Our meetings and liturgical preparations have followed a pattern. The group planning each week develops the text study of the week's Jewish and Christian scriptures for our group to experience. We bring in music and other prosaic and poetic texts from our respective religio-cultural contexts, including Central American Catholicism, Korean Protestant Christianity, North American Judaism, and others. We also include selections from the Amidah and prayer intentions or requests, and we make kiddush and motzi with the same bread and wine over which we perform a memorial blessing. As a Jew, I was very familiar with the Christian scriptures. When we came together as a prayer group, it's fascinating and enlightening to learn these texts alongside Hebrew scripture. The most eye-opening experiences for me were the connections my housemates made with the two texts, often showing that we share the same values, while our religious stories may differ. Before hearing Christians speak about their texts, I thought that everything they would say would point back to Jesus. As a Jew, I was always confused by the Trinity. How can three entities be one? Or the converse, how can one entity be three? What I learned was Christians struggle with the concept of the Trinity as well. We would often come to the same conclusion when studying texts, that loving one's neighbor as oneself is the highest of belief a Jew or Christian can hold. While this teaching was sometimes attributed to Jesus, it was not always explicitly so, and was revealed as a universal belief we all held.
Another aspect of our community's interreligious practice that has cemented for us the necessity of explicit interreligious recognition and dialogue has been around the celebration of holidays and important events in each other's lives. We have shared celebrations of major, minor, and personal favorite seasons, events, and practices in our different religious calendars, including Pesach, Shavuot, Tisha B'Av, Tu B'Shvat, Hanukkah, Rosh Hashanah, Advent and Christmas, including lighting a Christmas tree and crowdsourcing daily Advent reflections, Lent and the Easter Vigil, including Ash Wednesday and the Via Crucis, Stations of the Cross, and a wedding. Personally, I have found the interreligious facilitation of the Christian holidays I habitually celebrate to clearly illuminate my unexamined assumptions about traditional practices, to make glaringly obvious the ways in which unattentive Christian cultural practices have supersessionist and even anti-Semitic connotations, and to make vitally urgent the interrogation and reform of these practices. Whereas there exists a vague awareness that Christian celebrations may be problematic, The insular Christian-only celebration of Easter, for example, does not make the correction of these problems urgent. To my own fault, it has only been while preparing a reading from the Gospel of John for an interreligious commemoration of Good Friday that I found myself unable to utter before my Jewish housemates the anti-Jewish language of the NRSV. Other Christian housemates and I found we had to produce a new translation of John 18-19, adequate to the needs of our community, so that we could articulate our anguished hope for the resurrection in the midst of global insecurity, face to face with our Jewish housemates. Just as I needed to reconfigure Christian practices to be shared with my Jewish housemates, so they have celebrated holidays like Pesach, Shabbat, and Rosh Hashanah with gracious hospitality. I am continually struck by the wealth of melodies and traditions to which I am invited, despite having shamefully little sense of their origins or how to follow along. Feel free to yai-dai-dai as a constant refrain from my Jewish siblings. And the experience of being a guest in my own house, as my housemates share their ancestors' songs with the descendants of their ancestors' bullies, is one that highlights for me that neither sane belief nor uniform religious practice are strictly necessary for humanity or for justice.
Another site of shared interreligious growth has been impromptu dialogue occurring outside of our formal liturgy and shared celebrations. These conversations have been an opportunity for learning about one another's religious traditions, including matters of practice, doctrine, and personal experience. Besides the simple transferal of knowledge, I, for example, had no idea that singing and yai-dai-dai comprise such a central feature of Jewish worship. There is also a growth in knowledge of how our religious traditions might relate to one another. For some Christians in the house, especially those whose approach to non-Christian religions is shaped and informed by the conciliar declaration Nostra Aetate, the shared spiritual patrimony which ties the people of the New Covenant to Abraham's stock, those are English quotations from Nostra Aetate, represented in shared texts, so like the Jewish Tanakh / the Christian Old Testament, and in theological commitments that the Lord is one, for example. This shared spiritual patrimony presents an opportunity for mutual understanding, respect, and familial dialogue. In the course of dialogue around these points of Jewish-Christian contact, however, it became clear to me that my Jewish interlocutors did not always share my enthusiasm for this common heritage. Indeed, some confessed that they found Christian claims to Jewish sacred texts a bit weird, perhaps even outright objectionable. We did not always resolve these tense discussions. I confess that the Gospel's claims make little sense to me apart from the context that's set by the Tanakh. And not every conversation that we had concluded in total agreement on matters of belief or practice. Yet still we gathered to worship and to pray, to sing and to celebrate. Still we organized to defend our housing needs and advocate collectively to our landlords. Despite tension or disagreement, we found that we needn't be in total agreement to be a community. We needn't hold all the same doctrines or perform the same practices to gather in awe and joy and remorse before the divine. We needn't agree on who or what the divine is, to work together in pursuit of justice and basic human needs, informed by our similar and different religious values.
As a Jew in these same informal conversations, I continue to wonder about and struggle with what to make of Jesus as a potential Jewish teacher for me, and how to approach Christianity with an eye towards learning and shlemut, wholeness, in my own practice of Judaism. Judaism has so much wisdom that nourishes me, and I also want to continue to be open to the wisdom of other traditions. For me, this can mean looking to a Christian text on forgiveness as a place where I feel like Christian wisdom and focus might be stronger than in Judaism. Or as a Reformed Jew, I might reflect on the idea that I do deeply believe that Shabbat was made for humans and not vice versa, thus linking my ideas about Shabbat practices to Jesus's views as expressed in the Gospel of Mark. My ability to continually be in conversation with my housemates allows me to explore and dive deeply into this personal work of thinking about what I can learn through Christianity. Conclusion. Curiously, the sense of loss of community that inspired the creation of our worship space at home is a loss we anticipate feeling as we return to our home communities of worship. Our reflection on the before times have resulted in an awareness that siloed worship dulls our awareness of and attention to our pluralistic and interreligious reality outside of synagogue or church. While we lived together before COVID-19, we did not worship together. We also experienced elsewhere so-called interreligious worship that was not compelling or felt empty or inauthentic. What precipitated the positive interreligious worship described in this paper was the sudden acute awareness that we shared vital concerns, namely housing and human connection, and we brought religio-cultural presuppositions to the means for fulfilling those needs. These three nodes, faith, culture, and justice, are inseparable, essential elements of our shared life together, both within the Barton House microcosm and in an interreligious, multicultural society.
We have become aware in our bodies and in the rhythm of our days that there exists no sphere of life in which religion is not at play. We cannot go to synagogue or church and decide there how our faith inspires our action in the world. Our religious motivations and our judgments about culture informed by religion must be part of our public sphere, whether doing dishes together at Barton, often late at night, or in our schools, newspapers, and community meetings. We must conduct ourselves something like choir members, singing as we do in our own house liturgies. We each came to our basic human community knowing our part, our vocal part, our own religious and cultural formation with a preferential option for justice. What we discovered living together is that there are other parts, and when these parts come together, they comprise a whole song. As we listened to each other's parts and measured our own tempo, volume, and key, we harmonized into that one song, meeting our needs, embracing one another, and keeping a roof over our heads. For however long our choir lasts, and as we form parts of new choirs in the weeks and years and lifetimes to come, we hope that the musical training we've received here will leave us longing for other voices, lest we rest content with a lonely melody. As in the words of the song we sing, may our mouths be as full of song as the sea is full of water. And we have a brief audio clip to play for you.
All right, let's thank our participants. That was wonderful. A huge thank you to the four of you. That was fantastic. Dr. Ammerman, your 3 to 4 minute response here to this presentation.
Great. I'll try to keep it brief.
I know that's okay.
this is really quite a lovely reflection on your experience of expanding interreligious living from dialogue and cooperative justice activism to include worship. I want to question, however, whether Tymire is really the person who's going to give you the kinds of resources you need for thinking about this. I think you already knew a lot about how different cultures shape the way people think about and do justice. You were already exploring what you can and can't learn from other religious traditions, and you were already working on how different religious dreams coexist and inform each other. I think what you learned and are learning in this experiment is not so much about how different ideas can be brought together, but about how and why practice and experience matter. In a passage that Andrew read, you say, not every conversation concluded in total agreement on matters of belief or praxis, yet still we gathered to worship and pray, to sing and celebrate. Still we organized. Despite tension and disagreement, we found that we didn't need total agreement to be a community. We needn't hold all the same doctrines or perform the same practices to gather in awe and joy and remorse before the divine. That's really a lovely passage. And what you're pointing to there is that worship taught you that gathering in this particular way was a way to experience together awe and joy and remorse before the divine. It's about singing, as you just showed us, and celebrating. You discovered a new way to experience a kind of common spiritual ground from which you can now pursue your justice goals and your ideas about how interreligious living works. I hope you'll continue to think about how that common ground rests on what you do and experience together as much as on what you think, forming a foundation for all of what you do. I hope you won't quit doing it.
Thank you, Dr. Ammerman. Our next presenter today is James P. Ferus. James Ferus, Society of Jesus, is currently completing his STL at the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University. Ordained a Jesuit priest during the summer of 2020, James has embraced the necessity to adapt his ministry to the unanticipated needs of the church. His interest in the significance of online spaces in the life of Christian communities is reflected both in his thesis research and his service to Our Lady of Lourdes in Oakland, California. James, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nathan. Would I be able to share my slides?
Should be able to share your screen now.
Great. So I have chosen for my cover page here a screenshot that was taken by a friend and colleague here at the Jesuit School of Theology, Lisa, who's with us in this gathering. It's a screenshot of the live stream Christmas Eve service that I was presiding at. However, as a violinist and violist over the course of my life, I've been a part now of many of these recordings where you pre-record in your own room and then the editor brings together and creates a collaborative recording. And all the other folks who are in this are members of the choir at Lourdes who've been gathering every Sunday in the afternoon for fellowship, even though they haven't been singing. So this recording was playing during the Christmas Eve live stream that I was presiding at in an empty church, because at that point all California churches were closed. We could only live stream and be outdoors, and this was playing on the screen as I was presiding. So it's just, I find, a microcosm of the of all of the overlays that have been a part of our landscape and the communities that we've formed. And I think it also represents all of the potential for our creativity in worship and in fellowship. And now I'll continue on to, and how I've experienced this, both as a digital millennial, digital native as a millennial, and now as a pandemic native as an ordained priest. So Pope Francis devoted his general audience at the beginning of this month of February. I read this right as I was finalizing my draft of this paper, and he devoted it to offer a brief exhortation on active prayerful participation in the Church's liturgical life. He reinforced that the implementation of the Second Vatican Council's call to integrate private devotions into the public liturgical movements of the faith community, wherein Christ is present when believers gather to break open the word and break the bread in his name. Francis asserts that, quote, when the first Christians began to worship, they did so by actualizing Jesus's deeds and words with the light and power of the Holy Spirit, so that their lives, reached by that grace, would become a spiritual sacrifice offered to God. This approach was a true revolution, end quote. Yet Francis in this brief address does not mention the revolutionary intermediary step emerging during this present time of the COVID-19 pandemic, that I believe is transforming the contours of our liturgical and pastoral life, the proliferation of online gatherings among small but dedicated groups of the faithful for theological reflection. I use the term theological reflection because it is in these settings that participants share the graces and challenges of their individual experience and call upon the resources of Scripture, the Church's traditions, and their collective wisdom to search for deeper spiritual meaning that resonates with their circumstances. This paper contends that these gatherings, whose movements correspond to those of the first Christians as Francis characterized them, ought to be reconsidered as belonging within the Church's liturgical framework because they are proving to function as a bridge between private devotions and public Eucharistic worship. And during this time of a public health crisis, when that in-person Eucharistic worship has been heavily restricted and often moved to more passive online platforms, the emergence of interactive groups raises the practical question of whether these gatherings will serve as substitutes or supplements to the liturgical life of the Church moving forward. So this paper offers a distillation of my ongoing research for my STL thesis, and it begins by exegeting Luke's famous narrative of the encounter between two disciples and Jesus along the road to Emmaus. As a pastoral paradigm for accompaniment and engagement for our present situation of moving to the peripheries of digital meeting spaces. Now, once the hospitable disciples recognize the risen Jesus in his gesture of breaking the bread, we're told of their critical moment of shared theological reflection. When they ask each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us in Luke 24:32? These disciples are effectively processing in retrospect how moved they were by the manner in which Jesus dialogued with them about the meaning of troubling events. Interestingly, when this pair of animated disciples rejoined the established assembly in Jerusalem, they had to wait their turn before relating their life-changing encounter, as we see in verses 34 to 35. This detail ought to invite ecclesial ministers today to attend to the voices of the lay faithful who are actively engaged in fruitful theological reflection within the Church's online peripheries. Drawing on the vocabulary of Francis's recent address, how are their conversations engaging the presence of Christ revealed through relationships and experiences, actualizing his gospel in word and deed, and challenging the Church to adapt to revolutionary frontiers? Now, rather than raise these questions and then presume that some abstract theological reasoning suffices to answer them meaningfully and persuasively, this study turned to the people who have been engaged in these cutting-edge practices of lived religion. I've taken this snapshot by following Jesus's lead and immersing myself in the dialogical spaces that everyday Catholics occupy, so that I could invite them to respond to various forms of the open-ended question that Jesus asked. What sort of things? The method of this study is central to its message. to facilitate a theological reflection on the experiences of parishioners at 3 Bay Area parishes who have been participating in dialogical online spaces during this unsettled time of pandemic. And instead of collecting surveys that tend to produce some blurry pictures, I have engaged in interviews in order to provoke intimate and detailed reflection on personal experience. Because these online meetings take place within the everyday infrastructure of the internet, my subsequent analysis draws on both social theory and theological categories. In my choice of these 3 programs, I aim to establish a clear set of contrasts along distinct axes. The first was a Jesuit-sponsored parish whose spirituality center has sponsored a weekly faith-sharing group for more than a decade. This group offered a point of departure of a well-established culture of lay-led theological reflection that has navigated the process of converting to the Zoom platform. The second was an urban parish in which the pastor initiated a weekly homily help happy hour during the early months of the pandemic to strengthen parishioner connections and foster their engagement with the Sunday readings. The third was a suburban parish with a plenitude of faith formation programs that during the fall of 2020 sponsored a 10-week-long Bible study over Zoom entitled The Jesus Study, through which participants read gospel passages in advance, watched expert-led films from the Holy Land, and then shared insights and questions in a forum moderated by a lay staff member. Given that each of these groups averaged 8 regular participants, I was able to interview nearly every participant individually over Zoom. A few participants submitted written responses to my open-ended questionnaire, and the latter 2 programs participated in lively focus group conversations. I specifically interviewed the facilitators so as to include their perspectives as integral members who uniquely contribute to and feed off of group dynamics. Also worth noting is my rationale for focusing on parish programs. I was particularly curious to discover how these geographically situated institutions were able to adapt to a radically shifting sense of place for religious gatherings, compared with those more widely dispersed affinity groups already availing themselves of online platforms. In the remainder of this paper, I'll summarize first summarize and then analyze the themes that emerged from the interviews, and then propose key pastoral applications. I concluded nearly every interview by asking what the wider church can learn from their program, a question that morphed during the H4 focus group into, what would you tell Pope Francis about your online program? A plea resounded across all 3 programs for a church that listens. This recommendation reflects the overwhelming sense of appreciation for how these programs cultivate contemplative listening among fellow believers, both laypersons and clergy, new members and veteran facilitators alike, and that this collective practice of attentive listening is a profoundly treasured gift, especially during chaotic times. And so this report adopts the practice of Verstehen, aiming first to understand participant responses on their own terms. The opening question I asked about what attracted participants to their respective programs invariably prompted personal narratives that situated the present desire within the context of lifelong faith journeys. Nearly every participant previously had been involved in intentional small group activities ranging from Christian life communities to charismatic groups, as well as programs for initiation and even reinitiation into the church. Several indicated that they were presently active in additional online devotional and enrichment programs, some through the same parish, but for many others, through other parishes or organizations. In the majority of cases, they joined as a result of a friend's invitation. When later asked about their engagement in parish life, the majority of respondents expressed how important it has been for them to practice their faith beyond the Sunday Eucharist, yet how rare such groups have traditionally been in parochial culture. The strong level of reflexivity was further underscored by what participants most valued about their program, a question that typically precipitated further insight into what sustains their involvement. For members of the two scripture-focused programs, while their curiosity to learn more about the scriptures drew them in, they soon discovered that they most appreciated listening to the insights and stories shared by others. This theme overlapped with that of longtime members of the faith-sharing group, who consistently extolled the value of regularly connecting with a dedicated group, who know the contours of each other's spiritual journeys and feed off shared stories and wisdom. When asked how these conversations compared with those typically following Sunday liturgies or with family and friends, most noted a strong contrast with regards to depth. They commonly spoke of the superficial nature of social hours over donuts, including the brief conversations they might have with a priest. Furthermore, only a few indicated that they had like-minded spiritual conversation partners among spouses or close friends. Instead, they actively seek out these dialogical spaces as contrast spaces, as, quote, sacred ground, end quote, when one can vulnerably, quote, express myself as a child of God. Several credit the work of the facilitator for creating such safe spaces, especially when the initial round of sharing affords each member a turn to speak uninterrupted. These personal exchanges have been particularly valued during this period of social isolation. Responses to the effect of the pandemic itself on the quality of participation were interspersed throughout the interviews. Nearly half remarked that the online format afforded the necessary convenience to attend, in some cases due to health restrictions and others for ongoing circumstances like child or elder care that made weekday meetings at the parish difficult. Interestingly, several remarked that the subject of the pandemic only played a minor role in their discussions, hovering in the background while ordinary challenges of life came to the fore. The move to Zoom was most impactful for the faith-sharing group, where members noted the trade-off that several long-timers could no longer meet, yet others were now able to join or rejoin. Members of the Jesus Study noted how they all had just elected to continue meeting for an additional 10-week course. A couple H4 participants remarked how the group shrunk from its first meeting of 15 to a smaller yet steady group of 8, which they believed to be ideal because of the intentionality of the regulars, a theme shared across the programs. These expressions of increased intentionality of allocating the resources of faith via online programs, including the distinction between consuming produced resources and participating in networks, deserve greater analysis as instantiations of active use of culture during what sociologist Ann Swidler coins unsettled lives. Of particular curiosity then were the responses from members of H4 as to whether they believed they were actually helping their pastor prepare a Sunday homily. There was near unanimous agreement that while the pastor opens the session with sophisticated insights, their subsequent stories and questions prompt to, quote, trigger their priest to then explore themes more deeply over the course of an hour than he possibly could in a 10-minute sermon. They consequently regard their role as being representatives of the average parishioner in the pew. They appreciated witnessing the humanity of their priest, letting his guard down in this less formal space, and they paid closer attention during Sunday liturgies to hear how he incorporates their stories. The emergent theme about the role of the priest, and more broadly, the presence of experts within groups, connected with the questions of the impact of these programs on Catholic identity and their reflections on what the Church can learn. A member of the Jesus Study captured the ambivalence other respondents had towards the possibility of dialoguing with priests, noting that, quote, we want our priests to think the best of us, unquote, and that were their pastor to join the group, he would need to be patient with their pace of self-discovery. Most members of the faith-sharing group identify as feminists who have found a welcoming space where they can practice their Catholicism, especially when they grapple with controversial teachings. Some H4 members of Filipino and African descent indirectly expressed their hesitation to speak in contradiction to the priest, yet in subtle ways voiced transgressive moments when their viewpoints diverged from his. To borrow from sociologist Irving Goffman, this dynamic of expression and impression management when it comes to defining the situation and the role of the expert within it deserves considerable further study. The pastor's take on what the church can learn captures the enormous potential for dialogical spaces. And quote, I think that what we're seeing here is what a genuine participation of the lay faithful can look like, that they have something to offer, that the Holy Spirit is alive and working in them, priest and people together. In the past few weeks since I drafted this paper, I've subsequently been doing that deeper analysis. I've come to realize that, like Emmaus, the present times are certainly unsettled. And as a characteristic of unsettled times, we're creating new strategies for our lived experiences of worship, of fellowship, and of theological reflection. We can look at all these new parish strategies, the places, the spaces, and the times in which we gather. And we can see that the new spaces and times are also prompting new strategies for how we dialogue with one another. This new allocation of these resources and the new strategies is highlighted by making a comparison between the groups. That long-term theological reflection group, an established group, shows that the spatial switch, having to move from being in person, which was so valued to them, prompts some reflexivity on their new meeting strategy. And it also firms up their discourse strategy. They value all the more the supportive listening that they can provide to one another during these unsettled, chaotic times, that they get to narrate their stories and see how they connect to the stories of the larger faith community. By looking at that established group, we now can see what's going on in the newly established programs that have only begun during these months of pandemic, and how they are then reframing the strategies that many Catholics were used to for how they engaged scripture, engaged one another, and engaged their pastor. We're seeing them grow to accept that support is something that Catholics can do, even if they've been used to being part of support groups in other facets of their life, such as for an illness or an addiction. And then they see that this new way of expressing hospitality is part of the support. They're also reframing their roles and authority, especially the group that sees the priest within their circle and sees him from his living room and office rather than just preaching at them from the pulpit. Yet other groups aren't as quick to accept this new blending, this new mixing. They're also coming to recognize the value of experiential learning, that they can't just separate, well, the priest has academic book insights and we have life experiences, into scripture and living out the gospel. They're now coming to see that the ability to narrate, to tell a story is so elemental, a point that Christian Smith brings out in one of his chapters of Moral Believing Animals. So what can we learn at a liturgical and pastoral level? The need to blaze more accessible trails to that liturgical summit, as it were, as Sacrosanctum Concilium calls it, the summit of our lives. Well, how do we get to that summit? Is the summit too high? One, it would require at least a full chapter to adequately explore the themes that emerged from these interviews. I'll briefly name a few of them. The first is to indicate that summit, and several respondents cited an increased longing for it. The growing success of dialogical spaces during the pandemic restrictions and in spite of dispensations clearly represents a strongly valued strategy for blazing these accessible trails to the peak moments when we gather together for worship. The consistent feeling of disconnection with online liturgy suggests that if the hybrid models of liturgy continue, the sense of spiritual nourishment and interactive learning derived from these programs could drive them to the point of even appealing as substitutes to liturgy. How then can these seemingly pastoral spaces for theological reflection actually be reframed to the people of God as valued component of their liturgy? With regards to the locality of a parish, while some participants avail themselves of the capacity to zoom in from afar, most articulate the importance of connections, at least at a regional level. Additionally, a turn to pneumatology also deserves further consideration, as the majority of respondents enthusiastically spoke of the working of the Holy Spirit in their communicative encounters, including those that aid in the creation of the pastor's homily. This ought to spur pastors who seek to bridge the gap between their exegesis of the scripture and their exegesis of their parish, rather than eisegesis of reading into the parish. The Emmaus story pivots on constant role reversals when it comes to who is welcoming the stranger and engaging in vulnerable dialogue. Even though there have been widespread reports of, quote, Zoom fatigue, the participants in these Zoom groups recognize the opportunity to reflect what one coined a, quote, radical hospitality that cannot necessarily be offered when serving donuts after Mass, a way of attending to the stories of others in the presence of Christ, of learning to be more like Mary than her sister Martha. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, James. Dr. Ammerman, your response to James's presentation, please.
Well, I actually have a lot to say about this paper. There are some really strong points in what you've done here. You start with a really good theological question about the meaning of liturgy. You draw on a really interesting set of empirical findings and comparisons. You also throw in some good, useful social theory and arrive at what I think is a very satisfying practical theological conclusion, calling for liturgy to include attending to the stories of others in the presence of Christ. And I think that phrase, in many ways, really captures the lesson, the theological lesson that you've learned here. Along the way, you really do have also some very interesting observations about, for instance, authority and the role of priests and how they may complicate these conversations. But nevertheless, if the priest listens to them, you might actually learn something, might actually have a better homily. I do want to spend a little bit of time also drawing out some observations and wonderings about the role of technology in structuring how this works. You call these interactive gatherings as opposed to passive ones. And I think that's a really important contrast worth pursuing in terms of both how we think about online gatherings and how we think about physical ones. What is being learned here from this kind of interactive form of spiritual conversation? But online, is there a critical difference between a gathering where everyone but the speaker is muted and one where people can freely unmute themselves and leave the microphone on? And that's related to another musing I had about size. You noted that these groups tended to sort of settle in at around 8 participants. And that's about how many can really comfortably fit on a Zoom screen. And my bet is that any group that is big enough to need 2 screens wouldn't work. But then group dynamics, like Jesus actually long posited that 12 is a pretty good number for a good sized group conversation. The final note I want to make here is that it was really gratifying to note the way your findings dovetail with the kinds of things that I discovered in the study that's published in Sacred Stories, Spiritual Tribes. I talked there about circles of conversation with spiritually like-minded others. Those that circle might be a family, work friends, an intentional group, co-participants in some sort of face-to-face activity in a congregation. But people who had those kinds of interactions were far more likely than those who didn't to see a spiritual presence in their lives and to pursue intentional spiritual practices. In other words, in Christian theological terms, they were more attuned to the presence of the Holy Spirit. So yes, I agree. There's some pneumatological work to be done here as well. So congratulations on putting together a really interesting study that asks these important theological questions and allows us to think really creatively about the role of the technology in what we're seeing happening in congregations of all sorts around the world.
Thank you, Dr. Ammerman.
Thank you, Dr. Ammerman, and thank you again, James. Let me introduce our final presenter for our session together today. Nicholas Sawicki is a fourth-year evening student at Fordham University School of Law and is a Duffy Fellow at the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University. In addition to his academic work, Nick is the special assistant to the president and editor-in-chief of America Media. Nick holds a BA in theology and history from Fordham University and a certificate in American Catholic Studies from the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies. Nick, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Nathan Woodhouse for coordinating this session and to Professor Ammerman for moderating. I'm pleased to be here with you all today, and I'm grateful that the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life has convened this conference. Today, I'm going to discuss what I consider to be one of the great oxymorons in our collective vocabulary, innovative Catholic Church. It sounds like jumbo shrimp or military intelligence. It doesn't quite hit the ear in the right place. The Catholic Church is, in my view, one of the most innovative and forceful change makers in history, and my paper analyzes how the Catholic Church has and has not harnessed this legacy to innovate in the United States in the face of the pandemic. Additionally, I'll discuss who, more so than what, has driven innovation in the American Catholic Church and where mission-critical failures have occurred during the pandemic. One of the most important charisms in the life of the Catholic Church is that of innovation, which is a rebuff to the common imagination that would paint the church as a static creature, entombed in archaica, instilled by tradition. Yet throughout history, the church has innovated. Now, what exactly does that mean? It means that it has not only created new things, but it has adapted, it has discovered, it has developed, implemented, analyzed, and replicated to bring the best methods and means forward to, in the words of Pope Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno, fully cultivate and develop all man's faculties unto the praise and glory of his Creator, and to bring the gospel message to the corners of creation. Though Catholics assert that the Church is divinely established, it is an institution administered by humans and is therefore liable, from an institutional perspective, to fall into the same faults and failings of its administrators. Change for the fallen man is a difficult process. It involves removing or altering that which is comfortable, that which makes people feel secure. It is a source of tension, and too often church leaders and officials have fallen back on emphasizing, even enshrining, the status quo in the belief that maintaining course will ease the tension. Life will be easier, the reasoning goes. Sadly, that is not the case. Nothing is accomplished without reasonable change, and the church must embrace it as it has so often before, especially in times of crisis. Because of the decentralized nature of the Catholic Church, a vast majority of these innovations take root at the local level. And the most successful ones bubble to the surface in the form of national institutions and organizations. The innovations of the church are drawn from hard experience, an everyday ethos that drives change for the better. Take this example. A local parish in New England in the late 19th century is faced with an increasing number of the men in the parish being maimed and or killed in textile mills, leaving numerous families destitute, based on the economic model employed in that time and place. The parish priest, in cooperation with lay leaders, forms a council by which the men can buy insurance policies for the families at very low rates that are sourced through their collective donations. Seeing the value in this model, it is replicated across Catholic parishes throughout the United States, and today it is known as the Knights of Columbus, one of the largest insurance and philanthropic organizations in the country. It's a national movement born from a local need, replicated and adapted to other local circumstances to address similar problems. Another example of a local innovation meeting local problems and becoming a national trend is found in the work of Nelson Baker. As a young priest, Baker was assigned to an orphanage significantly in debt. As a way of raising capital, Baker wrote to postmasters throughout the United States, asking for the names of Catholics in their communities that he could write to in order to secure members for what he called a spiritual guild. Baker not only raised the money needed, but was able to grow this fledgling guild into what became known as the Association of Our Lady of Victory, which produced income for numerous other charitable works, giving homes to literally, by the end of its term, hundreds of thousands of children, forsaken mothers due to social circumstances at the time, the poor, the sick, the needy, the destitute, anyone who was in need of his care because of the system he had set up. And because of this initial idea of solicitation through the mails, the United States Postal Service recognized Baker as the creator of direct mail, what we would frequently refer to as junk mail today. But it was a solution at the time to a local problem that has become a national business innovation. These are just two brief examples of how individuals in the church have innovated in the American context explicitly at the local level that grew into national trends. The list, frankly, can go on, and while I won't expound further on too many of these, I would be remiss if I did not explicitly mention the incredible work of women religious in the American church who were and remain leading localized innovators in such fields as education, healthcare, and social services, and in so many areas throughout the United States. Their work, for a multitude of primarily ecclesiastical and political reasons, ended up being forced into remaining localized entities and siloed from one another until the mid-20th century. While these examples are poignant, they are by no means meant to limit the life and thought of the church in North America. It's important to understand that the church didn't only begin new undertakings in 1492. The innovative nature of the church stretches back nearly to its foundation, with the early adoption of the Roman diocesan model as a governance for hierarchy, the adoption of the university system from the Middle East, which allowed for professional and intellectual class to develop, and as well as the adoption of Islamic banking models coming from the Crusades. The adoption and expansion of these existing ideas were meant to serve intellectual, temporal, social, cultural, and evangelical purposes all at the same time, while having a wide array of added benefits to the society at large. Each of these monolithic achievements, the growth and success of which we would now generally ascribe to the church in a colloquial sense, are really, again, just local developments replicated for their efficacy and adapted to provincial demands that became hallmarks of a Christian society that the church dominated for so long in Western Europe. This method of discovering, replicating, and adapting to overcome localized problems has remained an integral part of how the church accomplishes its mission. The question now is whether or not the church has been able to harness this particular charism in the time of COVID-19, repurposing resources, redefining methods and missions, and empowering, cooperating with, and leading its members to meet the needs of this great challenge. With all of this in mind, I turn now to the question of religion and the pandemic. I believe it's more than fair to say that the COVID-19 pandemic caught the world by surprise and upended much of the way in which Western society conducts itself. Our governmental, healthcare, educational, financial, philanthropic, and labor sectors have all come under immense strain. For institutions like the church, which has a wide and varied set of interests across all of these sectors, the strain can be particularly devastating. However, the interconnectedness, vast resources, lay expertise, and institutional unity that the church enjoys places it in a unique position that, while incredibly exposed as so many of its institutions are, to also coordinate resources to having a lasting impact. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced adaptation at the church that may not have otherwise happened, but will likely aid the long-term ability of the Catholic Church to fulfill its mission. There are three key examples I wish to highlight as to how the local church has innovated in this pandemic. My first example is a new partnership announced between Catholic Charities USA and the Felician Sisters of North America. As of December 2020, the 9th month of the COVID pandemic, nearly 10.7 million Americans were unemployed. Because of shifting employment circumstances, housing has become unstable for millions more. According to some reports, if moratoriums on evictions are lifted, 40 million Americans could be made homeless. With this issue already at hand and threatening to become more dire, Catholic Charities and the Felician Sisters established the CCUSA Francis Fund for Eviction Prevention. The fund, which was initially valued at $2 million, is a means for Catholic Charities to get funds directly to those who are facing eviction, an issue that they know can lead to a host of other poverty-related issues an investment in solving a problem now as opposed to a multitude of problems later. My second example looks to pre-existing institutions adapting themselves to the pandemic. Long-established institutions are once again adapting to meet the immediate needs of those for which they care. Catholic hospitals and clinics in particular have a history of using this adaptive approach. A primary example is St. Joseph's Hospital in the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis, which was founded in 1853 by 4 sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet to address a cholera epidemic that afflicted the community at the time. In recent years, it has served as an emergency care center, but in light of the growing demand for mental health and addiction services during the pandemic, the hospital is now transitioning to full mental health and addiction care. According to the American Academy of Medical Colleges, 40 million Americans struggle with addiction, and as a result of the pandemic, experts are seeing increased numbers of relapses, of overdoses, and various other addiction-related issues, including death. The shift at St. Joseph's Hospital is a result of the administration and the Archdiocese asking a very simple question. How can we best use the resources, talents, and technology that we have to serve those who we serve, and then landing on a solution that helps those that they're best able to serve in a way that has the greatest impact. My final example comes to the question of sustaining our most local and most frequently visited institution, the parish. Parishes and their staff have had to make massive shifts in how they conduct themselves during this pandemic. While there is some data on just how many parishes had the capability, for example, to live stream a mass prior to the pandemic, as we've also heard in today's conversation, reporting from various news outlets indicates a sharp increase in the number of parishes doing so, taking on that capability. As the church cannot gather as a physical community, it may still gather as a spiritual community, and a live stream mass or other liturgical service can go a long way in sustaining that community. The concept is not so foreign. Catholic ministries have been sharing and broadcasting the mass via film and television for nearly 9 decades. The reticence around technological expertise and the fear that American Catholics may not physically attend church when they can just as easily tune in requires a mindset shift in this technological age. Additionally, the way parishes fundraise has also radically shifted by moving to a digital format where possible. In the absence of an usher-driven basket, many have established means for online donations. The Center for Church Management at Villanova University, in a study they conducted, has found that parishes that did not implement online donation capabilities have seen as much as a 50% drop in donations, whereas digitally savvy parishes have been more likely to see increases in annual donations. The church's continued use of modern technology is key, as it has been throughout the ages, to fulfilling its mission. The church and its institutions must identify, develop, adapt, and implement, emphasis on implement, new methods as they become available to effectively to meet the needs of their communities, to evangelize, to ensure its future success, and most importantly, as Pope Benedict XVI reminds us in Deus Caritas Est, the church, as God's family, must be a place where help is given and received, and at the same time, a place where people are also prepared to serve those outside her confines who are in need of help. While there have been notable successes, mostly on the local level, there has been an equally notable leadership gap that must be addressed as to why the national church is not planning for a healthier and more equitable society in a post-pandemic world. In this time of societal upheaval, when the most vulnerable are on full display, the church needs to make full use of its prophetic voice. In 1919, the American bishops proposed a bold plan of social reconstruction following the First World War and saw significant portions of it developed and implemented under the New Deal. Following the Second World War, the American bishops established broad-reaching domestic and international charitable institutions, Catholic Relief Services being one of the most eminent amongst them. The American bishops today, as the institutional leaders of the Catholic Church in the United States, need to establish a clear platform that prioritizes what the church advocates for in a post-pandemic society. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the disparities in labor, in healthcare, in education, housing and food stability, racial divides, policing the justice system, and the American system of government have all been laid painfully bare. Now is the opportunity for decisive planning, to call upon various Catholic leaders and experts, clerical and lay, and those outside of the church, to present a truly Catholic model to promote a more just and equitable society. Such pooling of resources and expertise would also create opportunities for collaboration, like that of Catholic Charities and the Felician Sisters, to address problems in the here and now. But there have to be central, coordinating forces behind these efforts in order to introduce stakeholders to one another, to identify systemic national problems, and to present localized solutions with resources and expertise to effect lasting change. This will not happen so long as the hierarchy within the Catholic Church in the United States does not plan, engage lay leaders and experts, and address these issues with the materials and personnel that they do have at their disposal. The collective church in the United States, primarily in the form of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, may not have the canonical means to address such an effort, but it does have the political and social means and capital to make it a reality. It is an abdication of collective authority not to act in such a manner. The Church in the United States must seize on the charism of innovation as it has before, just as Pope Francis has with the Holy See's COVID-19 Commission, and utilize all of the resources at its disposal to provide the leadership, guidance, expertise, and resources necessary to meet localized problems and national trends. Its continued failure to do so is not only at its own cost, but at the cost of those it seeks to serve. As Pope Francis reminds us in Fratelli Tutti, the vulnerable members of our families, our society, our people. It is also key to the church's witness. A church focused on defending the status quo is not a prophetic church. It will be seen as interested in its own privileges and fearful of the kind of conversion it preaches to others. Embracing and fostering innovation is good for the church as well as society. In conclusion, the church is a resilient institution dedicated to spreading the word of God for the salvation of souls. That's its mission. In order to accomplish this most sacred charge, the church has and must continue to adapt to meet the demands of the present while communicating its timeless message. In order to follow Christ's command to be fishers of people everywhere, the church must embrace the God-given intelligence, creativity, and innovative abilities of her people. Drawing on its historical drive to innovate, the local church must continue to seek out new partnerships, new opportunities for service, the best means by which existing institutions can serve their communities, and employ the newest technologies to communicate the gospel. And the national church's failure to plan, study, analyze, and advocate for certain societal policies and efforts is a blatant lapse of prioritization on the part of the institutional church. Now more than ever, the church needs to innovate so that it may bring people closer to God. Thank you.
Yes, much appreciation. Thank you, Nick, for that presentation. In our remaining approximately 7.5 minutes together, I'd like Dr. Ammerman, of course, to respond to Nick's presentation. And then I would like Dr. Ammerman to go ahead and provide some sort of summary comments for us.
It'll be tiny.
Yeah, that's fine. And I'm sure there are a number of questions rolling around in people's heads. I hope you can find a way to connect with one another to address those questions. But I want to make sure we honor everyone's time here today. So let's turn to Dr. Ammerman first.
Well, I think this paper really does provide us some suggestive possibilities about the capacities for innovation that may be present in the Roman Catholic Church. You point to things like interconnectedness, the vast resources, the lay expertise, and the institutional unity as among the structural factors that make it possible for information and resources to flow across boundaries and aid the spread of innovation. The examples that you provide make me think that, in fact, this is a paper about examining innovation in Catholic social service. And that made me want, because all of the examples have to do with moving from the parish into a situation where new organizations, new ways of organizing are established in order to deliver social services. And if that really is the case, it may be helpful to signal that up front, and also to draw on some of the literature that addresses innovation in the philanthropic field. I think your examples also point us toward the really important reality that innovation takes place in a particular cultural context. Can we imagine asking postmasters to deliver names of the Catholics in their area? to a religious organization in today's world, in the United States at least, or pointing to the reality of the relationship between church and state in the medieval period and the way that shapes what's possible and not possible. So what I'm suggesting really here is that innovation isn't just a thing, but it's a process. It's a process that needs to be understood in terms of its cultural context, in terms of the particular structures that make things more and less possible, and an analysis of where the effects of that innovation are actually felt. And I do want to close by saying I think it's really cool to look at that Bishop's 1919 document and think about that in light of the Biden recovery package and how much similarity there is between the things the bishops were calling for. And just suppose there's a connection. So my summary comments, very briefly. Few takeaway points. First, resources matter. People do what they're able to do. Second, imagination matters. Even when there are few resources, connections with others, especially others who are different from them, can spark imagination about how to do new things. Third, conversation matters. Spaces for spiritual conversations, even or perhaps even especially on Zoom, can open up new horizons for the life of faith. Fourth, technology matters. It really does structure what we do, making some things possible and other things less possible. Fifth, even when some aspects of worship are limited or absent, new practices can emerge that then help us to redefine what worship means. And finally, people really still want to gather. They want to touch and taste and smell and hug and sing.
Thank you so much for those summary comments. It's been a real pleasure to have everyone together today. We do have 3 minutes. I want to remind us that we've been used to having 15-minute breaks between our sessions. We're actually only going to have about a 5-minute break because the final closing ceremonies begin at 3:20, which is in only 8 minutes. But was there anything very pressing that someone just really needed to get off of their chest before we end our time together? Wow, stunned into silence, I think. Well, let me just offer my thanks again to each of the presenters and to Dr. Ammerman also for moderating. It has been a really wonderful day spent in time together and just fawning over one another academically, which is always a favorite thing to do, but it has really been enriching. So I'd like to thank everyone, and we'll see you in a little bit at our closing ceremony.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.